This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
About the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center. At the height of his career, North Carolina-bred gangster Frank Matthews was more well-known than Frank Lucas, who of course was the subject of the 2007 film American Gangster. Frank Matthews was rumored to be the inspiration for the blaxploitation classic Black Caesar. Today, filmmaker Ron Chepesiuk joins us to talk about his new documentary on North Carolina-bred Frank Matthews, the disappearance and the rise of a black gangster. And later we're joined by filmmaker Jonathan Gayles, who talks about his new documentary on black masculinity and comics. Today on Left of Black, we discuss black masculinity in documentary form. I'm Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black. Welcome back to Left of Black, and we're joined this afternoon by writer and director Ron Chepesiuk, who's talking about the new film, the Frank Matthews story, the rise and disappearance of America's biggest kingpin. How are you doing today, Ron?
I'm doing fine, Mark Anthony. How are you?
I'm great. You know, hip hop has done a great deal of, if you could say, kind of detective work around you know, making famous all of these kind of black drug mafia figures, you know, from the 1970s. And so we know some of the names, Nicky Barnes, you know, out of New York, folks like Frank Lucas, who of course was the subject matter of the film American Gangster with Denzel Washington. But many folks don't know about Frank Matthews, and you argue in the film that Frank Matthews was the biggest of them all. And of course, there's a whole story about his disappearance, et cetera. Talk a little bit about Frank Matthews, who Frank Matthews was, his connection to North Carolina, and of course, you know, how you got interested in his story. Right.
Well, if you saw the movie Usual Suspects, I like to describe Frank Matthews as the Kaiser Sose of the international trade. He's an incredible character, very mysterious. Had a really big impact, and it all started in rural North Carolina. He grew up in Durham.
Went to Hillside High School, yeah.
Right, left when he was a teenager, and very ambitious, when I understand, from talking to some of the sources. Ambitious in a different sense. He wanted to make it in the criminal world, evidently. So he went north, and he went to Philadelphia first and spent a little time there. Evidently dabbled in the numbers racket there, and then moved to New York City, where he began in the numbers and wanted to break into the drug trade. But at that time, the drug trade was controlled by the Italian mafia, the white mafia, and black drug dealers and associates really had menial positions in the drug trade. They're on the street selling the stuff, getting down and dirty with the product. And if you wanted to enter the drug trade at that time, you really had to deal with the Italian mafia, and it was a real sort of a humiliating experience, I guess, if you were a proud person, because you pretty well had to go to hand in hand with them and allow them to break into trade, because they controlled the French Connection, which controlled 95% of the heroin trade in the world at the time. The French Connection is a misnomer. It's called the French Connection because of the way it was set up, where the opium was grown in Turkey, in Marseille, France, where it was processed, and it was shipped to New York and Montreal. Gotcha. So it was a 95% monopoly. When Frank Matthews reached New York, it was about 67, 68, 69, and a lot of changes going on in America at that time. We had the Black Power movement, right? We had the Vietnam War going on, which created a huge heroin epidemic, right, especially in the black community. At one time, by the late 70s, they said 12% of all U.S. soldiers returning from Vietnam were heroin addicted. Yeah, yeah. A lot of those soldiers were black soldiers. So Frank Matthews, and grew up in this milieu, and a lot of black gangsters grew up in this milieu, and they were pretty well tired of the subservient role they played in the trade. Matthews was lucky in a sense because a numbers operator took him under his wing that he worked for and introduced him to a Cuban drug dealer named Rolando Gonzalez. And Gonzalez was a big player in the drug trade at the time that was under indictment. And he did the same thing Matthews was to do in 1973. He jumped bond and fled and went to Venezuela. And when Matthews was shut out of the drug trade because he arranged a meeting, and of course, it's hard to document this thing because you're dealing with criminal history, but the story goes that he had a meeting with some members of the Gambino crime family and was turned down in terms of breaking into the trade. And so this numbers operator introduced him to this Gonzalez character who had fled to Caracas, Venezuela. And so Matthews ended up going to Caracas and establishing this independent pipeline that circumvented the Italian mafia. Yeah. And being the ambitious guy he was, and also not only that, he was an incredibly entrepreneurial individual. You talk to police that investigated him, that tracked him. They have a grudging respect for his intelligence and for his abilities. And he was able to set up a drug ring that operated in 21 states. Now, if you look at some of the other major dealers that sprung up after Matthews, and Matthews is sort of the Al Capone of the black drug trade, he was the first big one to operate. And so when Matthews and when Lucas and them came after him, they were essentially New York City drug dealers, operating in New York City. Lucas was in New Jersey, operating in New Jersey and the big market. Matthews was setting up franchises all the way up down the East Coast. And as I pointed out in the documentary, one of the prosecutors that prosecuted Matthews said, if he wouldn't have been busted, he might have set up a network that could have been the most powerful international drug ring by the time he got through, because he was setting franchises up all the way up the East Coast, and he had plans to go into California when he was indicted in 1973. So Matthews, in that way, was the pioneer. He was the first big black drug dealer. He may have been the first international American drug dealer. Ike Atkinson, who I've also a book on, operated about the same time, but he operated in Thailand. I'm talking about Matthews because he operated in New York City. He lived in Brooklyn and then moved to Toad Hill in Staten Island. So in terms of stature, he is, without doubt, one of, if not the biggest drug dealer in American history. And what's amazing is that nothing's been done on him. When Black Entertainment Television did those 3 years of American Gangster, I kept crossing my fingers because I was researching the subject for 5 years, and I kept saying, someone's got to come up, going to do something on him, and nothing was ever done on him. There was a book in 1977 called Easy Money, but it didn't deal with the really interesting part of Matthew's story, what happened to him after he disappeared. So when Al Prophet, who is the co-producer and co-director on this project, approached me, I had gone through a couple of other people that actually produced what they needed to produce in order to make this a reality. I ended up joining with Al, and we put our skills together last fall, and the result is this documentary.
We're here with Ron Chepesiuk, who with fellow filmmaker Al Prophet have done a brand new film, The Frank Matthews Story, The Rise and Disappearance of America's Biggest Kingpin. Why do you think he hasn't gotten the kind of attention that some of his peers have gotten?
That is a really good question. I think this may sound kind of trite, but I think he was born lucky. I would think he was born lucky. If you look at his story, what's really amazing is that when he went away, when he disappeared, the Drug Enforcement Administration put a $25,000 reward on him, and at the time it was the largest reward ever put on a fugitive since John Dillinger in 1931, right? Right. Well, in 2012, the reward is still $25,000. And who the hell in today's world is going to stick their neck out and become a snitch for $25,000. Now,
Yeah.
$25,000 in 1973 was a lot of money on that sort of thing. And if you talk with the Bossier was gone for 16 years, right? Matthews is almost gone 40 years, and Bossier was a neighborhood hood compared to Matthews in terms of being a gangster. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. And also, it's really hard to explain because when it boils down to it, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that he is alive or dead. There isn't a pic, like when Bossier was caught, they had a picture of him in the late 1990s of him at an ATM machine in Europe. So they knew he was alive. They had reports, that he was living somewhere in the United States. He was coming back to Boston. But Matthews, there's absolutely nothing. And in the documentary, I explain one of the marshals that spent years of his life tracking Matthews. He said it was like he disappeared off the face of the earth. And so that's the most intriguing thing that has made him sort of a Kaiser Sose. I mean, did he really live? I mean, did he really exist?
Yeah.
He's such a mystery. And I think as the years go on, he's going to be a even bigger mystery. And he's going to be one of the biggest mysteries in history. He's going to be up there with, the guy that robbed the airplane, right?
D.B. Cooper. I mean, he is the black crime world's D.B. Cooper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, his story is more amazing than D.B. Cooper because we know more about D.B. Cooper than we know about Matthews.
Right. And of course,
really.
And he's a black drug dealer dealing in a system that ostensibly is
and
against
that,
him. Yeah.
Right. And that leads me to the last explanation of why he's not doing. I think there's some prejudice involved in this too. The fact that he was a black drug dealer, he never was taken that seriously as some of the other dealers. You know what I mean? And he wasn't considered as important, even though he was in terms of what he did and who he was.
You'll be screening the film here in Durham, North Carolina on March the 3rd at the Hates High Heritage Center here. Of course, Matthews has these Durham connections, went to Hillside High School, grew up here in Durham, North Carolina. What are you hoping that some of the audiences will get out of the film and really as the example of Matthews' life? Well,
I hope that we told a good story. Okay. Because if nothing else, we're not trying to glorify Matthews.
Right.
I mean, he contributed to a heroin epidemic that swept, America
right.
in the 1970s.
Right,
and
the original war on drugs, right?
Right. Especially hit the black community. But we don't look at it as our responsibility to preach to our audience, right? We're just filmmakers, and we're both interested in Matthews, because he's such an interesting story. But I think that if you look at his life, I think that what is really amazing is how this kid who grew up in a real rural area, very poor, in a small southern town, can go within a matter of years to the level that he did. It just shows you how much talent is out there.
Yeah.
On the wrong side of the law,
No,
right?
Right.
On the wrong side of the law, because I've done a lot of this. I've done a lot of books on. I'm always amazed at these guys, and I've talked to law enforcement. They always say, like Matthews, one of the prosecutors said in the documentary that he could have been a CEO of a major corporation.
Yeah.
He exhibited all the skills of it, and so I think that that is one of the things. Telling a good story and a very interesting personality, and I think one of the other questions is that Matthews may have gotten away with $15 to $20 million, but is it really worth it? Is it really worth it? Considering what he did, what he may have had to do,
right.
If he's still alive, and I believe he's still alive. Ask me why, I'll give you some reasons, and they could be as good as somebody that studied this subject that believes that he's dead, because the arguments are compelling on both ends of it. But I just have a feeling that he's still alive for some reasons on that.
Yeah, maybe he'll show up at the screening here.
Well, but I get some calls at night where you hear a click on the end, right? I wonder if I'm saying, is Frank checking up on me? And this is such a bizarre story because I heard stories like there was a funeral a couple years ago and Matthews showed up at this funeral dressed as a woman, right? And I wanted to interview this one guy, and I had somebody as an intermediary approach this guy, and he said, "Oh no," he says, "I don't want to do this. You know, Frank Matthews, you know, might find out and all this." And so the source that I was using as an intermediary went back a couple weeks ago and talked to this guy, and he said, "You remember that guy that said that he couldn't talk, and that he said he was talking to Matthews?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, he said that he talked with Frank." I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Frank said he told him that I was working on a project about him, and he said, that's okay. It's about time somebody came out with the story." And so my question to the source was, where was he? And so the source said, "Oh, the guy said he was in Chicago." And I'm thinking to myself, if you're Frank Matthews with $15 to $20 million, and this was like in the wintertime,
You're not in Chicago. We've been joined by filmmaker Ron Chepesiuk, who with Our Prophet has just done this wonderful new film, The Frank Matthews Story, The Rise and Disappearance of America's Biggest Kingpin, which will be screened here in Durham, North Carolina at the Hayti Heritage Center on March the 23rd, 2012 at 7 p.m. Thanks for joining us, Ron.
Thank you then, Mark Anthony.
Looking forward to meeting you. Take care.
Okay, then I hope to see you there. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Frank had more money than mine. Matthews was the number one. He would have ruled the United States.
Frank Matthews was a much larger drug dealer than Frank Lucas.
He's literally fallen off the face of the earth.
We were hustling and trying to make a living here in Durham. I was working at a supermarket. He was working over in North Durham.
Received a call down to the Old Farm Exchange Poultry Department. Saw a young black male running through the woods behind some houses. We arrested him for stealing chickens that day.
All of us were trying to make a nickel and a dime to keep ourselves going.
When the cold wind comes, it lives in New York City.
In the 1970s, we had a heroin problem in the country, definitely in New York City.
A river of money is flowing because business is so good.
It was a gangster town. You know, nobody wanted to go to New York City.
And what evolved here, he took over.
He was a guy that had great leadership skills and knew how to control a product, make distribution all along the East Coast, and control an organization through violence and intimidation.
A state senator from Baltimore, and Frank had him killed.
And he had been identified as one of the largest, if not the largest, heroin trafficker in the United States.
I supplied all of Baltimore, though. Baltimore alone, on millions.
He had given $1 million to a friend to hold. And he said, "Frank, when you gonna come get that money?" He said, "I'll come get it in a week or so." So how much money does he have?
He put $4 million on the table. And he says, "Let me see if you can match this."
A lot of people looked up to Frank for probably all the wrong reasons.
You could pick any car you want in the driveway. He said, "You could pick one of my cars." In that sense, he was very nice to me. Even though what he was doing was wrong, you know, he made it possible for a lot of people to have a lot of things.
And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have finished my last year of law school.
Frank was a robber. They really believed in this guy. And he hated the Italians because they hated the blacks.
And his goal was to unite and form a family where they cut out the Italian mafia.
Castellano and certainly Three Fingers Brown would have wanted him killed.
We never had a solid lead on Frank Matthews. We felt like he had disappeared off the face of the earth.
So he had $15 million and 6 months head start.
The way he lost himself was he cut all ties with everybody he knew.
He done like that.
I mean, people speculate, plastic surgery.
All of the agents who work on the case to this day believe he's still alive.
I don't see how he could be alive.
He's alive, and that's it.
Welcome back to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Professor Jonathan Gayles, Professor of African American Studies at Georgia State University, and a filmmaker, director of the film White Script and Black Superman, Black Masculinities in American Comic Books. How you doing today, Professor Gayles?
I'm here with Anthony Neal, so I couldn't be better.
So in some ways, this is really unexplored territory. I mean, the last thing folks think about when they think about comic books, of course, is race and blackness. And not only do you explore in this film, you know, this larger history of black presence in comic books, but the role that these comic book spaces play in articulating different notions of black masculinity. And of course, in the film, you have a wealth of talking heads and thinking heads and folks who are doing illustrations. How exciting was it for you to work on this project?
You know, it was very exciting and also very affirming. You know, I grew up reading comic books, and there was always this sense of frustration, this dissonance, and I had a sense that I was dreaming someone else's dreams. I loved comic books. They provided me with a sense of escape and the kind of liminal space I was living in as an adolescent. But you know, all of the heroes were white, and you know, I picked up actually this book here, Luke Cage, one of my old school comic book superhero. I was out with my wife Pam in Little 5 Points here in Atlanta. And I picked this old trade paperback up and decided to, I'll look at it, just for old time's sake. And I started reading these comic books, and I was really offended by what I saw. Offended because the images were so problematic, the storylines, the narratives were problematic. Yeah. But also offended because as a young person, I consumed Luke Cage. I loved Luke Cage, and I consumed him uncritically. And so to find out that there were many other scholars who are placing comic books within the realm of popular culture and engaging them critically was very affirming for me. So I'm very excited about the state of the project.
Yeah, I'm always amazed. We have a common friend and colleague, John Jennings, who of course both teaches comic book history, but also is an illustrator himself. Right. And to see how locked in he often gets, and almost entranced, talking about the details of this. I have to wonder, you've done this documentary, right? And of course it's going to be distributed by California Newsreels.
Absolutely.
Shortly. But you've been traveling the country, with this documentary. It was, an official selection and winner of Best Documentary Feature at the 2010 Urban Media Makers Film Festival. Yeah. What has it been like to screen the film? And we're talking to Jonathan Gayles about his new film, White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinities in American Comic Books. What's it been like to go out traveling with the film and to be able to engage with audiences? Many of them who felt the same way you did about this kind of absence of a sophisticated presence of blackness in comic books.
It's really interesting. I go to a festival and I do a Q&A afterwards, and there are all of these adults, people my age, 40 and up, who, sometimes people will say, I always had a problem with that particular character. Or that always bothered me growing up. Why is Luke Cage wearing chains? Why is he bound to Harlem? Why this, why that? And so it's always this sort of, I'm going to use the word affirming again. You find out that you're not isolated in the way that you might have felt as an adolescent, because we're talking about people thinking retrospectively about these superheroes. These are the first African-American superheroes in comic books. And so people reflect back, going back decades, and there are these experiences that are very profound for them. And the other thing that I find is people get upset. I had a young man well, not a young man, in Norfolk at the Mid-Atlantic Black Film Festival who got really upset with me. He said, look, I loved the Falcon. Why did you have to ruin the Falcon? But
with bringing all this critical sensibility and stuff to it, right? You just want to enjoy your comic.
Exactly. If we can't escape in comic books, where can we escape?
Right.
But that's part of the point, is we have to be critical about what we consume, and it really is very ironic. Sometimes people say, well, comic books are for kids. And there are two problems with that statement. First is that it's not true. Comic books right now are really marketed, for adults.
Right, particularly graphic novels, right? I mean, that's...
Exactly.
Right.
Right. And James Peterson uses graphic novels in his class at Bucknell, and many, Keanu Whitted at University of South Carolina, Columbia. But the other problem, this is a more significant problem. It's almost as if, because something is allegedly marketed towards kids, it's not as important.
Right.
And if we're marketing towards kids, we should be even more
so. Right.
Right. So it's been a very interesting journey for me.
We're here with Jonathan Gayles, filmmaker and professor of African Studies at Georgia State University, talking about his new film, shortly to be distributed by California Newsreels, White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinities in American Comic Books. One of the working themes that you've been using in talking about your film is this notion of Shaft or Sidney Poitier.
Yeah.
That the presence of black masculinity in comic books and really broadly in black popular culture has to be one of these two poles, right? It's either someone who is disturbing in the way that Shaft might be read as disturbing, or someone who really acquiescence, right. To whiteness and mainstream culture in the figure of Sidney Poitier. And I get the sense that what you're trying to do with the film really is to collapse and talk about what's going on in between those spaces.
Right. No, absolutely. And it's I had to change the title actually, Mark, because there's really more Shaft than Sidney Poitier characters.
Absolutely.
I mean, let's be clear. And so, I think, in looking at these characters, Jeffrey Brown, who's at Bowling Green State University, wrote a great book on Milestone comics, and he talks about the fact that the black masculine body is already a site of hypermasculinity, in terms of how it's constructed and understood. A lot of people have done work in that regard. But then he says, what happens when you make this black masculine body superpowered? What happens? And so he uses this phrase, a potentially threatening cluster of masculine signifiers, and so it becomes too much.
Yeah, right.
And so what happens is, if you watch the documentary, essentially what we see are these devices used to mitigate the power that these black superheroes might have. And so there are all these devices that undermine their superheroic potential. And I think it's a really, really interesting take on comic books, black masculinity, and popular culture.
You mentioned Milestone Comics, and one of the great stories that comes out of your film and recent discussion about comics, particularly with the recent death of Dwayne McDuffie, is this phenomenon known as Milestone Comics. And not enough folks know about this attempt to really put blackness in a proper context in the comic book industry.
Right. And Dwayne McDuffie is a giant, and I get so many emails now from the site with people saying, I wish I had known more about him. I wish I had known about his work. I wish Dwayne had been creating his work when I was an adolescent, because to have Dwayne there was almost as if someone was dreaming with me instead of dreaming for me. You know what I mean? And I think, Dwayne's work, and then also we have to understand that there's this really vibrant community of independent artists and writers, and they generally are collectively called the Black Age movement. And there's some clips on the site that deal with these writers and the movement itself. And so there's this vibrant effort to respond critically to this limited range of representation and to expand it in ways that are really, really dynamic and kinetic. And I really want people to take advantage of this opportunity to engage these independent artists that are doing some really incredible work.
We're sitting here with Jonathan Gayles, a professor of African Studies at Georgia State University and a filmmaker, director of the new film, White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinities in American Comic Books. One of the interesting stories around, the presence of blackness in animation was the short series Black Panther. Something that was produced and the intent that it would be shown on black entertainment television. There were a few episodes very early on that circulated on iTunes that you could download, and of course now you can buy a videotape at least of the first 8 episodes. I was fortunate to watch those first 12 episodes on Netflix. Talk a little bit about the story of the Black Panther. I know sitting there watching it, and I watched it with my 2 young daughters, who
the world of girls,
who and watching it themselves could reflect they had never seen anything like this, right? And this attempt to, on the one hand, tell black history with a contemporary film, to acknowledge the groundbreaking emergence of Barack Obama, to offer some soft nudges and jabs at the Bush administration and their idea of foreign policy. It really, for me, was a very exciting and rewarding, visual and consumption appearance, right? Why doesn't BET pull the trigger on this, right? Why isn't this something that, as I think about, this kind of renewal, I talked with Kelly Jones, the art historian, earlier, and I talked about this idea that there's a sense that black culture is fatigued, right? At least as it's expressed in mainstream popular culture. And I looked at Panther, and this was something that was exciting and refreshing. Why does it die?
Right. Mark, I know you're not really asking me to explain it. Come on, man. Come on. But, I think, I would certainly agree with you. It's a groundbreaking series. And it's completely tragic that more people don't have access to.
Right, and haven't seen it. Right, absolutely.
It's a tragedy. Julian Chambliss, who's at Rollins College, wrote something about this where he talks about this idea of digital access. And so you have this empowering character, and yet you have to order it online, go on Amazon, etc.
Right.
And I think it really does speak to, a broader context for the documentary, really, which is certain scripts are acceptable, certain scripts are not. Right. And the idea of a Black Panther character like that doesn't really fit into the framework. And the other thing that's interesting about the Black Panther is, if you look at the original Black Panther, when he first emerged, he's a powerful character and all that. But in the first issues, he's serving white men.
Right.
Right. You don't see him in his own country. At least McCutcheon has a brilliant take on this.
Right.
And so then you have this distinction between an African superhero versus African American superheroes. And the African superhero is somehow allowed to be a bit more powerful, allowed to have a bit more authority over his environment. Well, African American superheroes are not. So there's a lot going on in terms of how we understand these characters.
We're here with Jonathan Gayles, who's a professor of African and African American Studies at Georgia State University and a filmmaker, director of the new documentary, White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinities in American Comic Books. What's next for you, Jonathan?
I'm working on another project now looking at a retrospective analysis of the Ebonics debate. And I just started shooting some interviews with some people that were on the ground, people that are still on the ground dealing with, race, culture, language, education, educational policy. I'm really, really excited about it. And I need to say that I attended the Center for Documentary Studies Summer Video Institute 3 or 4 summers ago, and it was a at Duke University. It was a very, very rewarding experience. So I want to give those people a lot of credit because they taught me a great deal. So I'm interested in this Ebonics documentary and a few other projects as well.
Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon, Jonathan. Hope everyone will get an opportunity to see your film, White Scripts and Black Supermen, Black Masculinities in American Comic Books. And again, thanks for taking your time out to spend some time with us on Left to Black.
Hey, good to see you again, Mark.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.